Okay, welcome everyone to the Buddhist Recovery Network Academy. I'm Sila Siri. I'm joining you from New Orleans, Louisiana, here in the southern US, and I'll be your host today. I'm a member of the Buddhist Recovery Network board, and I have been joining this academy for going on 7 years now, either as host or tech support or an avid listener. And I just wanted to say, way to go to the Buddhist Recovery Network for this long running program. And sadhu to you for your presence here today. It takes effort. Just really welcome that effort and the way you're tuning in. So today in our academy, we have Caroline Brazier joining us from the UK. And the topic of the teaching is reaching out and connecting. So thank you again for being part of this community because I think we all make such great progress amongst spiritual friends. Thank you. All of our teachings are given freely, and we just really have some amazing teachers that are giving of themselves, giving of service, giving of their wisdom. And for those of you who may be leaving early, we will just add our Donna link so that you have an opportunity to express gratitude if you wish. And we don't have to worry about you scooting out early if you have to do that. So I just wanted to introduce you to Caroline. Caroline, let's see, you're a therapist, a writer, and a trainer, and your work focuses on Buddhist approaches to mental health. You're the author of 7 books on Buddhism, including psychotherapy, ecotherapy, and you take a holistic view of compulsive and addictive processes, underpinned by the core teachings of our human condition, and offer positive and practical ways to work with them. I will go ahead and be quiet now, invite you to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, I'm going to share screen in a minute. Let's find the right one. There we go. And we'll go to current slide. Oops. Right. Okay. We will go straight into a meditation, a grounding meditation. Actually, before I do that, I'd like to just say a little bit about what I'm going to be talking about today. So I will first of all talk a little bit about Buddhist psychology, because as you've heard, this is something that I've worked with for quite a long time now. So I'll talk a little bit about background in Buddhist psychology, and particularly how we can understand our processes that go on as a result of those things that Buddhism describes. And then I want to particularly focus around going outdoors, because as Sila Siri mentioned, one of the things that I'm very involved in these days is an ecotherapy training program, which is a program training therapists to work out of doors. And indeed, people of all different backgrounds. Not everybody is coming from a counselling psychotherapy background. We have people coming from all kinds of backgrounds who have an interest of working therapeutically, supportively with people in the outdoors on our program. So I'd like to give you some flavour of some of the ways that we find taking people outdoors helpful, and ways in which you might find are helpful. So I'm going to start off, as I say, with a grounding meditation. I like the word grounding because this is about our connection to the earth. So I'd like to invite you to just take a few moments now to really connect. So first of all, settle yourselves where you're sitting. Take your attention away from the screen. And just come into the body sense. Let your body be settled. And if you're not sitting comfortably, then just rearrange yourself so that your feet are on the ground, so that you're feeling the chair underneath you, seat underneath you. Because one of the important things when we meditate is that sense of support, and particularly the support from the earth. The earth is there underneath us, holding us. We just take it for granted that we can walk on solid ground most of the time. We feel that solidness through our feet, through our legs, through the pull of gravity on our bodies. And that solidness, it's both a reality and it's a metaphor for the solidity in our lives. So bringing your attention into the body, feel your connectedness to the seat that you're sitting on. Breathe out and let your attention go down. Notice the way that your body meets the surface of the seat. See what you can feel about the seat through your body contact. Is it upholstered, soft, or is it hard? Do you make an impression on it? Or does it resist? Notice your feet on the ground and feel the solidness of the ground underneath you. But probably most of your weight is actually on the seat. So take your attention into that contact. And as you sit, breathe out and take the attention down, downwards into the seat, into the ground. Notice any part of you that's resisting, and just let it rest into this moment of sitting and connecting with the earth. And in your awareness, know that whilst your seat is probably on a floor, there may be space under the floor. If you go down and keep going down, you will come to earth and rocks. You'll come to the solidity of the earth itself. And you can feel that contact, full of gravity on your body, something you hardly notice, but there, always holding you in connection to the earth, always allowing you to trust yourself to the earth. And then broadening your awareness, being aware of the air in the room around you as it rests on your skin, its temperature, its feeling quality. Feel it on the skin of your hands and your face. And notice it as it comes into your breath. following the flow of the breath at the nostrils. And being aware of the breath, moving inwards and outwards. The breath within the body, in the lungs, and the breath outside, mingling with the atmosphere of the planet. Know that as you breathe, your breath goes into your room, fills the room, stretching out to the walls, the windows, the door, and interpenetrates with the air outside, the wind, the weather, the atmosphere of the planet. And so in this moment, as we sit, we can be aware that we are breathing the air and sitting on the earth, and that all of us sit on the same earth and breathe the same air, which circulates endlessly, molecule by molecule, through us and around us and between us. And in your own time, starting to open your eyes and to see the light and the shapes in the room around you. Notice the colors, the brightness. Notice the gift of light that we receive every day. And then looking at the screen in front of you, at the image, at the other people. And we bring this grounding to a close as we see the path in front of us along this beach. And just take a moment or two, just have a stretch. Bring yourself present. Okay, thank you. So we're going to move on. And I'd like to start off, as I say, by giving you some basics on Buddhist psychology. Some of this will be very familiar to some of you, but maybe there'll be some ways of thinking about it that will be a little bit different. And I'd like to particularly lean it towards how we can apply it in our lives. So I want to start off with a teaching that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, teaching of the Four Noble Truths. And I want to start off with this teaching because it was described by Shariputra, one of the Buddha's disciples, as being the elephant's footprint. There's a sutta on the elephant's footprint in the Majjhima Nikaya. And this text describes how the elephant's footprint is so large that all the other footprints of every footed being on the earth can be fitted into it. And in a similar way, I think the Four Noble Truths give us a map of the whole of the Buddhist teachings and a way of understanding that can be a framework into which we can integrate all of the other teachings. So whatever teaching you read in Buddhism, I think you'll find it there, at least by implication, in the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths, we start with the noble truth of affliction, dukkha, and then we have the second noble truth, which is the truth of arising, the arising of craving. The third noble truth is the containment of craving. And the fourth noble truth is the spiritual path. And this is the Eightfold Path, which you may also be familiar with. And I'd like to focus here on the first two of the noble truths. So, first of all, the noble truth of dukkha, commonly translated as suffering. So you'll often hear people talk about the noble truth of suffering. I quite like the translation dukkha, or not translating it rather, and just using the word dukkha, because I think it allows us to use it in a slightly more technical way. And so when we look at the teaching, we discover that birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair are dukkha. Association with what is not loved is dukkha, separation from what is loved is dukkha, not getting what is wanted is dukkha. In short, the five clinging aggregates, the skandhas, are dukkha. So we can see that the first noble truth is all about, first of all, the things that happen to us, the existential things, the things we can't avoid, the basic truths of life that we experience, birth, aging, and death. But then our reactions to it, the emotions that come up in reaction to it, the sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, despair, and the disappointments of being separated from those we love and not getting what we want, and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go into it in detail, but basically what we're talking about is both the things that happen to us, which are unavoidable, the fact that we are born, that we age, that we die, and so on, and the fact that we then have reactions to those which are distressing and which cause other layers of affliction for us. And then the second noble truth is the truth of arising, samudaya, and this is the response to dukkha. So in a way, in the truth of dukkha, we've seen that there are responses, and here they're described. It's the thirst for self-recreation that's associated with greed. It lights upon whatever pleasures are to be found here and there. It's the thirst for sense pleasure, being and non-being. And what I want to talk about particularly are these last three. So we've seen that these first noble truths are basically describing for us the way that life involves many things that go wrong for us, and that we multiply these things by wanting things to be different from what they are, and so on and so forth. But basically, in the second noble truth, we see that it's the arising of a response to dukkha, which is the real source of problem. And this is the thirst, the greed, the craving, and the thirst for self-recreation. So there's a lot here about how that reaction to the basic problems of life, the events of life that we don't enjoy, that are painful for us, the reaction to these lead us to build up a sense of self. And the last three elements here describe that process. So what we have here is basically a structure of ideas which starts off with the truth of affliction, that afflictions happen to us and that craving arises. And if you follow the Four Noble Truths, the next of the noble truths, the third noble truth, is the cessation of craving. This is about moving on from craving, not getting hooked by craving, and following the spiritual path. So we can see here that the Four Noble Truths explain the problem and then explain an answer to that, which is that we need to unhook from our craving and follow a spiritual path. But also, in the description of samudaya that we've just been looking at, we see that there is a description of how we get hooked into patterns of becoming, the patterns of creating a sense of self, but not necessarily a healthy sense of self, a protective sense of self, a whole lot of patterns that are basically our defenses. and that this happens through the three elements that were at the end of that description of samudaya. So if we look back here, these three elements in the last sentence, sense, pleasure, being, and non-being, these give us a really interesting typology for the layers by which we separate ourselves from the things that we don't like. We distance ourselves from these events in life that are uncomfortable. And we do this initially through sense attachments, and these then take us into identity formation, which then take us into non-becoming. So to look at this in a little bit more detail, when difficult things happen, according to the teaching of Samudaya, we tend to look for distractions. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, when things are unpleasant for us, when we feel uncomfortable, what do? Basically, we use our senses to distract ourselves. And we can see this on a very kind of mundane level. So, you know, we come home from work, we've had a difficult day at work, and we get home and we're feeling tired and fed up. And what do? We go for something that pleases our senses. We have something to eat, we put on the telly, we have a hot bath, we go for a run, we maybe get into drinking or drugs or whatever if we're going a bit further down the line. But, you know, whatever it is, all of these things are sensory things that we're basically using to distract ourselves. Some of them are healthy, some of them are not healthy, but they're ways in which we are using our senses as a distraction. So this is like the first level of escape. So what the second noble truth is saying is that when difficult things happen, when we're faced with impermanence, basically, because the first noble truth is all about impermanence, things not being the way we want them, things not staying the way we want them. When we're faced with the truth of impermanence, we tend to distract ourselves with our senses through things that we enjoy usually, but sometimes through things we don't enjoy, but things that are powerful enough to be a distraction for us. And then bhava, becoming, those sense distractions become something that we keep repeating, and they become habits, and we start to identify with them. And as we start to identify them, we start to become and develop a sense of identity, which protects us from having to face our vulnerability, having to face our impermanence, having to face the losses in our lives, and so on and so forth. So really, we can see the self in this sense, what's being described as the self, as being that accumulation of habits that we tend to identify with. And, you know, if we think about that scenario of coming home from work, we probably each of us have our particular patterns of how we deal with stress. You know, maybe we're the sort of person who always goes for a run when we get home. We think of ourselves as an athletic sort of person, so we always go out and we go to the gym or whatever it is, but we do something that fits with that image of ourselves as athletic. Or maybe we're the sort of person who likes escaping into romantic novels. Maybe we think of ourselves as rather a romantic person, and so we curl up with a novel and distract ourselves in that way. And of course, these things build up into bigger pictures, and, you know, the sense distractions are not just about those immediate things, they're about everything that we surround ourselves with. So we can see that we actually create whole worlds of objects which reflect our sense of self. So the way we decorate our homes, the pictures we have on our walls, the books we have in our bookcase, the work we do, the clothes we wear, the people we associate with, our hobbies, everything that we do in our lives in some way reflects our sense of self and becomes a way in which we construct that sense of familiarity. And that familiarity itself creates a kind of sense of permanence and solidity that we hang on to. But in some ways, we're using it as a distraction. And I suppose what I want to get over here is that these are normal things. These are things that all of us do. it's not that, we're saying that these are necessarily problematic for the ordinary person. Obviously, the further you go down the line towards enlightenment, the less you're going to be using these things to distract yourself, but they're all part of the normal psychology. But the problem is that as we get more caught up in trying to escape from dukkha, the more we get caught up, the more compulsive these things become. And I think that that element of compulsion is the thing that we can really notice when we're observing our behavior, and noticing when we're getting too caught up in these behaviors. But broadly, they provide a kind of protective shell for us, which may or may not be problematic. It may be that that's fine. It enables us to live our lives, but it may be also that these habits are restrictive and they're limiting our lives. And then we have the third of these three elements, which are the three on the other path. And this is vivana, vibhava. And vibhava is basically the point where we give up on this, where we no longer feel that sense of being able to protect our identity through objects, and we just shut down. It's really that point of just seeking oblivion. And if we think about this at the extreme end, then we might start off in some way just using substances as a distraction, as a pleasant thing to do for our senses. They might become a part of our lifestyle. They might become something that we start to identify with to different degrees. And you can see how this is a stage that you go through, different stages of identification, and you become more and more caught up in something. But eventually you can get to the point where it's taken over completely and you just want to find oblivion. And, I think all of us have our moments of vibhava. All of us have those moments where we just want to blot everything out and just let something else take over. But for some people, that becomes something that predominates in their lives. And there's that retreat into non-becoming that's really the end of the line. So to go back to this diagram, which in many ways I see as a kind of map of Buddhist theory, on the one hand, we've got that path of the Four Noble Truths, which takes us to the spiritual path. And on the other hand, we've got this path of sense attachment, becoming and non-becoming. And that path of samudaya is the path that can lead us off into problems. And it's a path which disconnects us from life. I mean, one way that I think about this is that the Four Noble Truths are really about connecting with life, whereas samudaya, the path of disconnection, is the path by which we shut ourselves off in a kind of bubble of our own ideas and desires and sense of self and rigidities and everything else that kind of centers around ourselves and gets in the way of us really engaging with life in a full, meaningful way. And, of course, this diagram shows us two extremes, but we're all somewhere in the middle between these two. Sometimes we'll be closer to the spiritual path. Sometimes we'll be more caught up in the path towards non-becoming. But most of the time we're kind of wavering in between. But I think having an understanding of these two directions gives us some idea of kind of how to navigate ourselves. So we surround ourselves by a world of objects which reflect our sense of self. Things which are important or familiar are often thought of as mine and function as supports for our identities. And these can include all of the things that we identify with: our clothes, our possessions, our places that we live in, ideas, careers, friends, all of these things. They're all things that reflect our sense of identity. And I think one of the things to take into account with this model, excuse me, I think one of the things that's interesting about this and useful to bear in mind is that basically it describes a kind of addictive process, because our experiences of dukkha they're scary for us, and so we tend to get into habit patterns, and these habit patterns tend to repeat themselves. So once we've started to use a particular way of escaping, then that way of escaping becomes our habitual reaction to it. And these compulsive cycles of attachment themselves become a source of dukkha. So in that original description of dukkha, the last element in that description was the skandhas. And the skandhas are actually a description of this cycle of attachment where we see objects in the world, we grasp at the objects in order to alleviate our anxiety. Those objects then become something that we identify with, and that then leads us to create a mindset, which then leads us to grasp at more objects of the kind. And so this is basically the pattern that's described by the skandhas, and indeed the cycle of dependent origination. And it's got that compulsive element to it. And we can see this really as an addictive cycle. We go out looking for particular objects, and those objects then become part of our mentality. They become things that condition our sense of self. And then because we have that sense of self, we go out looking for more of the same objects. And so we go round and round this cycle. And so the roots of addiction are very much in the trauma, but they are perpetuated by this cycle of clinging and grasping. And this cycle creates a bubble, a kind of bubble around ourselves. We create a sense of safety by clinging to familiar things. And these reflect our sense of self and give us and help us to limit our anxiety levels and to get on with our lives. But they also become a trap, and we tend to live in a bubble. We end up with a narrower worldview and a range of experience. So, on the one hand, we can say that these provide us with the ability to live, and at a certain level, we need these kind of familiarities in our lives to be able to function. But when they become too compulsive, then it's like we're not looking beyond the sphere. It's a bit like if we think about the algorithm. If you're when you're on social media and so on, then the algorithm presents you with more things that reinforce the things that you're already interested in, and you can get into kind of bubbles like that. You're constantly being fed back whatever it is that you've been looking at. So whether it's sort of cuddly dog videos, or whether it's different kinds of I don't know, violent material or whatever, you're going to be going round and round and round these cycles and getting fed more and more of the same. And so actually it comes to the point where you're not seeing any of the news that reports on things that are of different interests or different points of view. For example, if you're a supporter of a certain politician, then you start to see more and more that relates to that politician, and less that relates to the other politicians, except stuff that's disparaging of them. Whereas if you're in the other camp, then you're going to get a lot of stuff that points the other way, and so on. And this is what goes on for us, and this is what we do for ourselves all of the time. Okay, so I want to just summarize this in a nutshell. So, Buddhist model. We react to our existential vulnerability with fear and anxiety. So this is dukkha. We started off in a state of fear and anxiety because we realize that we are subject. Basically, we're mortal. We're subject to change. We're subject to losses when those that we love die. We're subject to all of those examples of impermanence in our lives. And this fear leads us to fall into patterns of avoidance and denial, which often take the form of craving. So Second Noble Truth is all about craving, and that arising of sense desire, which grasps onto all sorts of sensory outlets and then becomes the sense of self. So the sense of self is founded on these patterns of clinging and is basically a defensive structure. And these patterns become compulsive and self-perpetuating. So we go round and round these cycles. So this is, I think, the Buddhist understanding of our psychology in a nutshell. And what do we do about it? Well, basically, if we look at Buddhist practices, we can see they're of two sorts. We can see that some Buddhist practices are about digging our way out. So a lot of the contemplative practices where we're meditating, where we're noticing the arising of different things in our minds, where we're trying to calm ourselves and so on, these are about trying to dig our way out of the construct, the bubble that we've constructed. Other kinds of practices can be about accepting a rope. So, I mean, for example, by taking refuge, that sense of refuge in Buddha, refuge in Dharma, refuge in Sangha, this is accepting the rope. So a rope is thrown to us from outside and we can connect with something on the outside. So we can basically deconstruct our patterns, or we can connect with something larger than ourselves, beyond the bubble, that will inspire us, will give us a sense of solidity, even when the going gets rough. We can have that sense of entrustment. And I think this, incidentally, is quite interesting if you are familiar with the 12 Steps program, because there you start off with this sense of entrustment. And I think it's an important aspect of it. So, you know, in Buddhism, we have both aspects to our practice. And I think it's good to think about having a balance of the two when we translate this into psychology. So we can think about therapy, psychology, as being, on the one hand, some aspects which are introspective, which are about looking at our minds, looking at our inner processes, looking at the way that we behave, being quite analytical and trying to deconstruct those. But we can also look therapeutically at connecting better. We can look at what's outside the bubble. Are there ways in which we can connect with things that we don't normally connect with in life? Can we expand our horizons? Can we feel in connection with the larger system that we're a part of? And I think this latter part is particularly valuable. It's something that we certainly work a lot with. How can we be better connected with others, whether it's other humans or whether it's taking people out into nature, which is what I'm going to talk about now. So going out into nature, this is one of the ways in which we can start to let go of some of those preoccupations. Going outdoors into nature, we find ourselves connecting with all sorts of things in all sorts of ways. Things appear which surprise us. Things change with the weather and light levels. We're active within an active system of living beings. And I think there's some important things here because, you know, it's like when we go out into nature, it's not necessarily predictable. You know, while we're sat at home, we have control over our environment to a large degree. We can put the heating on, we can put the light on, we can get out things that we possess and we can do things with them. We can cook our meals and so on. When we go out, we have no control over the weather. The time of day moves on of its own accord. The time of the year moves on of its own accord. And we become part of a different system. We become part of this bigger system that contains everything. We have a very immediate sense of our interconnectedness, which of course in Buddhist terms is something that we work with a lot, that sense of interdependence. And it's like these things, they face us with all sorts of things that maybe we don't normally come across in our daily lives. We come into our bodies, and that's important in itself. Connecting with nature has always been an important part of Buddhist practice. The Buddha and his followers practiced in the forest, and nature imagery occurs through the sutras. We also find that there are hermits in China, Tibet, and so on who live in nature, and the nature poet monks in Japan. These are all examples of different ways in which nature has been influential in Buddhism. You can see right from the very beginning that it's not really a religion that's necessarily confined to indoor practice. I mean, I was going to say it's not practice indoors, but of course there has been indoor practice from the beginning, but there's always been this sense of going out, and the most important aspects of practice have often been the outdoor ones. The Buddha, at his time, the rains retreat was a time when the rains came and the Buddha and his followers went into the forest, and they maybe stayed in their huts, but they were very much in touch with and you can imagine them sitting there with the rain pouring down and that sense of being surrounded by the greenness and the wetness and so on. And likewise, you find when you read the texts, there is nature imagery going right through them. The images of the Buddha lands with their jewel trees and so on. And particularly I wanted to mention here the Japanese, because in Japan, there's a very long tradition of nature poets and hijiri, the wandering monks, the wandering mendicants who wandered in the mountains of Japan, which are very wild, and expressed their spiritual experience by writing poetry. And there's some beautiful poetry that's been left by different poet monks down through the centuries. And these are just redolent with nature imagery. And what we find in these poems is that there are layers of meaning. So you have the natural images, but the natural images are very much reflective of the spiritual truth. So, I think these are very nice to work with if you are working in nature, to take some of these poems. But anyway, how do we work with nature? I'm aware of, yes, we're getting on with time. So encountering nature, very important here. And one of the things that we do in environmentally based approaches is to invite people to encounter the natural world with their senses. So, if we talked about the senses as being that first point of contact in terms of supporting our mind states, then that encountering with our senses, to be out in a forest, to touch the trees, to listen to the birds, to feel the air of the wind on our faces, to smell the smells of the leaves and the dankness in the rain. All of these sensory things, really important and valuable in terms of giving us support, but support that puts us in touch with nature. And we can use mindfulness, many different ways in which this becomes a mindfulness practice. So grounding ourselves, taking time to sit, to walk slowly, to observe the detail of things, to attend to our process and to attend to the processes that are going on around us. Sitting in spaces, watching, sitting and watching on our own, connecting to spaces and allowing things to connect to us, this stillness that we bring in, something very special about just sitting in nature and just allowing things to be there for us. And walking meditation outdoors, touching the earth, feeling the ground underfoot, walking barefoot. And being in nature can be a support at times when things are difficult. You know, when we go into nature, we experience things sometimes which are unpleasant. We see dead animals, decaying things. You know, you may find these fungi beautiful, but some people may find them less so. We see these things and we react to them. And we can notice these reactions, but we can notice also that it's okay. They're part of a bigger cycle of life. And we're much more conscious of that bigger cycle of life. So they come into their place in a way. And I think it's interesting how often, and very touching how often, when people have experienced a loss or grief, they go out into nature because that sense that somehow there is a naturalness in it. It's distressing, and yes, there's also a naturalness. So going out into nature, it gives us that connection. So I wanted to just finish off with this verse. This verse comes from a text called the Shoshinge, which is one of the texts that we use in Pure Land Buddhism, which is the form of Buddhism that I practice. And it talks about the light of Buddha. The light of compassion that grasps us, illumines and protects us always. The darkness of ignorance is already broken through. But still the clouds and mists of greed and desire, anger and hatred cover as always the sky of true and real Shinjin. Shinjin is faith. But though the light of sun is veiled by clouds and mist, beneath the clouds and mist there is brightness, not dark. When one realizes Shinjin, seeing and revering and attaining great joy, one immediately leaves crosswise, closing off the 5 evil courses. And I think, I mean, obviously there's a lot in this text that I could talk about, but the bit that I wanted to really get over to you is this sense that actually there is something beyond all those attachments that we have clung to, the things that give us that sense of self, those objects that form our self-world. There is something there that actually is protective of us, something that we can trust. And if we can just trust to let the clouds part a bit, then actually the light may come through for us.
Beautiful. Thank you,
Thank
Caroline.
you very much.
Yeah, just a really lovely presentation of the noble truths and this connection through nature.
Mm.
We do have a few minutes for some questions or reflections, observations from folks. Well, we've come to the end of our of the Academy session. We wanted to remind you that your generosity can help strengthen our community. It can help grow the Academy. It can be a practical expression of gratitude, metta, and there is a link in the chat. You can set it up as a recurring donation or a one-off, whatever you feel like. And we're going to add some links. Our next Academy is on November 3rd at the same time, same link, and we'll be hearing from Fresh Lev White. And we have a new series of podcasts that are rolling out slowly. And so I wanted to share the podcast link with you. And don't forget that we have a Facebook group. In fact, we have 2. We have a general Facebook page, and we have a more private group where there may be discussions that are, and we just have to answer 3 questions, and you can join that Facebook group. So for Caroline, I almost forgot. I'd like to share a couple of links for the tarektrust.org and also an Eventbrite event. There they go. Thank you, Beth. And
Yes,
I think,
ShrikiTrust.org's is our general organisational one, but the Eventbrite one's got our workshops, which are they're all ecotherapy workshops and some Buddhist psychology ones, but mostly ecotherapy. But they're all online and you can just dip into them if you don't want to do the full programme.
thank you so much. So I just wanted to end by just transferring our merit. May the merit we have gained go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings. May we all be happy. May we all be peaceful. May we all be safe.